Well, here we are in our third day of talking about mass-mediated communication. When we began our discussion of mass-mediated communication, one of the points that I tried to emphasize was that as we think about media, there is something unique about the experience of different types of media. We're going to make more of a point of that in these closing minutes of discussion of our topic, and also something about the notion of mass. That becomes increasingly important also in the last chapter, where we discuss the topic of why it is that now the new integrated computer-assisted communication technologies are beginning to reshape how we think about the way in which individuals use the media as a source of news and surveillance, of putting together the world, collating the world, and becoming entertained, doing things that are interesting and amusing. And we sort of pick up on that, building beyond what we talked about last time, ending with the discussion of uses and gratifications theory, to sort of say that there are some pieces that are added to that model, to that particular theory. And one of those is what we call play and entertainment theories. We can get that particular slide up. It's interesting to imagine that all societies, unless they are just under a great deal of pressure, and then there are even stories where people in warfare, that even children play, adults have amusing moments. I've heard people talk about being in concentration camps and still having some degree of energy for amusement. One of the themes that comes out of the literature in mass-mediated communication is that people like to play. It is a part of human nature. And it's important to realize, of course, that we are not the only animals that like to play. Any of us that have had cats know that kittens love to play, puppies love to play. Some of you look forward to playing ball with your dog. The dog chases frisbees. Maybe you have horses that play. Maybe even you have cattle or other animals, sheep or whatever they might be, that in various ways seem to just enjoy doing something that is pleasurable. One of the arguments that we make is that people are attracted to the media, and the media find attracted audiences, markets, because of this drawing together of someone trying to provide a product and someone trying to find and use a product which allows them some amount of enjoyment. So one of the premises that we find in the play and entertainment theories is that entertainment is a part of our playful activities. We use it to play and therefore are satisfied or not by the enjoyment that we get. It is altogether possible that long weekends are spent by some people watching football games, evenings spent watching basketball games. People like to watch soap operas. People like to watch dramas. People may listen to concerts on Channel 8, for instance, in Houston. One of the reasons that we can enjoy the media or the fare that is provided for the media is that we've actually learned to be entertained by what is provided for us. Cartoons and other kinds of entertainment fare were standard parts of the film industry, and then television picked them up and made their own cartoons. We now buy videos for children. We rent videos for children. We buy our own programming that is more at the adult level, something that we like to watch, the latest movies, old movies that are now replayed, classical movies, whatever it might be. Entertainment in this regard, then, the argument goes, is built upon a variety of universals. One of these universals is drawn from the work of Sigmund Freud. Freud contributed very little to communication theory, despite his popularity for much of the first part of the 20th century. But what he did talk about was that one of the themes that seems to be universal in the human spirit is the continual search for pleasure. And we do so in an infinite variety of ways. And a university campus is such a wonderful place to see this at work. We have people who are majoring in theater, people who are interested in entertainment program, We have individuals that are interested in sports activities, interested in arts, the visual arts. We have people that are interested in music and study music and perform music. So again, this notion of seeking and desiring something that is pleasureful. As ancient as the Greek dramas, many of you have heard about this, if not studied Greek dramas, that one of the assumptions that promoted the design and the popularity of dramas among the ancient Greeks 4 or 5 centuries before the birth of Christ was the notion that we like a dramatic catharsis. We like an ending that leaves us with some sense of awe, perhaps. We are struck by the problems of fate intervening against someone. We maybe like the ending of a movie where we are moved to various kinds of emotion. I know that it's often hard to describe some of these, and I suspect that when we go to movies, women perhaps are more likely to be emotional as they experience a movie. But there are moments in my own life where I've been very, very touched by the end of a movie. Many years ago, there was a made-for-television movie, as I recall. It was about the life of Brian Piccolo, who was a football player, and again, as I recall, for the Chicago Bears, who died very early in his life from cancer. And he had a very good friend, as I recall, it was Gale Sayers. And there was a friendship between these two football players that transcended the field, and it became very moving then at the end, where a world-class athlete ends his life. In one sense, you see, it's always a tragedy when people have an end to their life, but it played properly, used in a very skillful way, we can be moved by that, even to the extent that we remember these kinds of moments. Currently, there's a fair amount of debate about the third Matrix in the trilogy, whether the ending is a good ending or a bad ending, because that's often the last of the movie that we see and we like some sense. When we go to a movie, if it doesn't end right, we maybe feel that we're left up in the air. What happened that occurred after the movie, in a sense, ended? What about life going on? Sometimes stories end unfulfilled. Well, all of this is the notion that the media are there to help us to deal with various kinds of tensions in our life. We like resolutions to stories. Often in our own life, our lives feel that there is very little resolution. Tomorrow will be another set of problems. Maybe tonight while I'm watching television, whatever it might be. And we were talking about this in uses and gratifications. As we come close to the end of the semester, as I mentioned, some of you very likely to have stored up some videos that you want to see just as soon as the semester is over. Maybe you've got some novels that you want to read, meaning that we deal with a lot of the strains and pressures of life, and then when it's time to be entertained. Circuses would come to parts of the country during the summertime. Often when people were finishing their harvests or working very, very hard, it was an opportunity to go to town and to be entertained. Traveling shows, chautauquas, all sorts of things that people can use, these kinds of entertainment devices. Well, the media obviously understands this, and with the vast variety that now is available through cable and satellite videos, and now on the internet, we have a lot more opportunity to find stuff that is satisfying, gratifying, moving, amusing to us, whatever our particular preference at a given time might be. We like that which leads to favorable states, and we want to avoid the opposite. If someone tells us that a movie is not very funny, or it's not very sad, and we wanted to be sort of moved at the end, something like that, or maybe we're told that it's way too sad and we don't want to do this. We know, for instance, that there's a point at which children don't like stories that are too sad, particularly if it's scary about something that's way too close to their own life. Perceptions of play and the gratifications that associate with that vary a lot by demographics. What would be pleasant or pleasing to older people may not satisfy younger people. There are music, for instance, that younger people like, that older people do not. We often find that every generation of music irritates older people and amuses younger people. So we know that there are a lot of patterns of preference and liking and amusement and enjoyment. And what happens is that we come together, individual buyers and users, in some sort of a nexus with the media around where we can buy and obtain what it is that we like. Well, having focused on play and entertainment, we can then move on and take a look at some other theories. You should note that each of these theories in its own way adds value to our understanding of the media and the role the media play in our lives, giving us an opportunity to see more about the meaning that is a part of media. We have a couple of theories. The one that I'll focus on next is called semiotics. Some of you may have run on to the study of semiotics in other classes. Simply argued behind every set of symbols within whatever we might think about. We could imagine an ad, or we could imagine an entertainment kind of program, we could imagine sitcoms, whatever it might be, that there are varying levels of meaning within that, and we can dig and plumb and imagine and explore different levels of meaning. Sometimes we do that to find out the richness of the story that is being told, and sometimes we do it at a more academic level to sort of see what sense of the world may be reflected by what is said at a kind of level that is deep enough that it may not be as conscious to us as we might imagine, but nevertheless it could be influential in one way or another in our thinking. Now, carried far enough, we almost get into the level of subliminal influence. I don't believe in that. But I do get into a kind of thought that suggests that if we see certain patterns and themes over and over again, if we see certain symbols, if we see certain assumptions over and over again, that it may begin to be influential over the way in which we think about ourselves as a people. It may become a part of our culture. And you may remember that from the very first day of our discussion in here, I emphasized the fact that one of the roles of mass-mediated communication is to create, convey, and to reflect culture. We're very much talking about that now. The premise of this theory is that meaning structures of media content, and now we're really focusing on content, and keep in mind that content can be the words that are spoken, but it can also be the images that are created, lead to media effects by giving us terministic screens. Now, the semiotics folks wouldn't necessarily use the term terministic screens. It's convenient for us in this class to do that because we've learned from our second theory of language, linguistic relativity, that the terministic screens that we take on, the key terms that we use and adopt and believe, have a way of defining reality. That's a key theme here in this theory, that we're looking at the words that are used by the media over and over enough so that we begin to think through them to see reality. Meaning is more important than process in this regard. Some of the theories we focus on process, sometimes we focus on meaning. For instance, in organizational communication, we talked about culture and climate as meaning. What does an organization mean? What do we think about when we think about work? What do we think about when we think about our work, our boss, our role in society? Meaning results from signs and symbols that occur in layers of various depths, and this becomes important to us. You may remember when we were talking about the cultivation theories, I argued that if we see the same kinds of programming, over time we can begin to see how themes emerge that become sort of taken for granted. For instance, we mentioned the mean world syndrome. We mentioned, for instance, the Dr. Marcus Welby syndrome, that doctors are good and kind, they come to our houses, they take care of us, they worry about us, they think about us, they are more than just professional practitioners of medical science and art, they are friends, they are neighbors, they are a part of our life. What we mentioned about the Dukes of Hazzard, that was a program that had a lot to do with people driving cars very wild and perhaps recklessly. But in all the time that you watched the Dukes, they never wrecked their car, meaning that if we drive wild and recklessly, we can do so without problems. sex without consequence, alcohol use without consequence. Themes like these can begin to emerge because we see images over and over again of various kinds of lifestyles, practices, behaviors, values, and we see them as though they are real because we see them on television or we see them repeatedly, and they tend to reinforce one another, and over time we begin to imagine that these are ways of seeing the world. These become then our terministic screens. We see these worlds through media influence, and these screens can be very much taken for granted. One of the things that I selected, one of the clips that I selected was from CNN days after the fall of Baghdad, and one of the images that you have available to you is a group of individuals pulling down one of the statues of Saddam Hussein. Now, it's an interesting moment in semiotics here because it is symbolic to people who hated Saddam Hussein and wanted to see him fall, that now we can literally see him fall. He comes down as a statue. Now we can stop for a moment and think what his statue meant before his fall, or why was his picture on the currency of the country? Why were his pictures all over the place? Is because he wanted to establish himself as the father, as the person in charge, as the great hero of the country, as the great leader of the country. And so then when he is at least no longer in office in the same way that he was, because the military has taken over his office and his buildings and so forth, then there are people that want to see the symbolic collapse of his regime and see him pulled down. It's an interesting version of what we're talking about here. We see looting, etc., etc. Now, when we see looting on television, and we've talked a little bit about this as framing, do we see looting as lawlessness, or do we see it as people taking property which is theirs, which was denied them by the government? And so even in that regard, as we look at news, how does news frame what is happening within the world around us? We know, for instance, that the various news networks of the world, in their semiotic presentation of the events of whatever sort they are, will portray people as different characters and in different ways. We know, for instance, that in the media and the attention that has been given to the Bush administration, people in Europe, people in the Middle East, people in Australia and New Zealand, people in the Far East have often referred to him as that Texan from Texas. There is an undercurrent that runs throughout his administration, that he's a cowboy, that he's a sharpshooter, that he's got a quick six-gun, and he's going to shoot and to try to destroy an enemy by force rather than to reason, to think. These kinds of metaphors become a part of the semiotic thinking that surrounds the world as we see it out there, meaning that as we see it framed, as we frame it ourselves, as we select which frames we prefer, which media that we tune into, whether we prefer conservative programming or liberal or middle-of-the-road programming, whatever it might be. The screens predict that which is rewarding in the world. This is one of the reasons why, for instance, that I find it fascinating to see the portrayal that we give to ourselves and to the rest of the world through all of the hours of advertising that people can be submitted to during the time that they are watching television. Can we ask ourselves the question that if I am poor and I don't have all of the nice things that are presented as a part of a lifestyle because they are widely and repeatedly advertised, do I begin at some point to begin to imagine that somehow I do not have power, I do not have accomplishment, I do not have self-esteem? Too much, perhaps, of the identity of the American people is based upon purchasing power and not upon other values that we might see. We often have that kind of complaint that's very seasonal. We're coming into the Christmas time when this tape is being made, and there will be many people who complain about the fact that we worry so much about presents that we forget about why the presents are given. We forget about the families getting together except to exchange presents, that the commercialization is all important, and we even see repeated reports in the news media of how good a season it is, and are the merchants making a lot of money. And we know that many merchants work 11 months out of the year and make no money just so that they can be in business when it comes time for the end of the year holidays, I guess most particularly what we call in the United States Christmas. Screens predict what is rewarding, what is persuasive, what is informative, what do we need to know to be a functioning individual. They can give us impressions of gender, they can give us impressions of race, they can give us impressions of age, and all of this becomes a part of the entertainment and news fare that is presented to us repeatedly. These images and the deep images that go beneath them say something about the nature of us as a society, as a people. Gatekeepers, and we can think of them as two kinds. One of the gatekeepers is the group of people that put together the news, the editors, the reporters, and all of those individuals, the news directors that select what is even newsworthy, what should be put on. They begin to frame, they begin to screen, they begin to select. We know, for instance, that the news tends to focus on that which has gone bad during a particular day, do not necessarily tell us all the things that went right. So there's always that sort of negative bias to the news, which then leads many people in some studies reporting that there is this notion of the mean world syndrome, and if we watch too much television or a great deal of television, as we talked before, it may even give us this sense that there is a lot more crime and a lot more reason to feel insecure than might even be actually statistically true. Certain screens about events in various ways that become either meaningful or meaningless as they are interpreted. And the ways in which they are interpreted often reflect these very subtle, deep meanings that can suggest something about who we are and where we are in the world around us. There's been a lot of discussion about whether the United States is entirely too unilateral in many of the events that have taken place in the last number of years. Are we thinking only about ourselves? Are we interested only in the Middle East because it is a reservoir of oil? Do we really want the oil simply because we want to drive wastefully around in SUVs? Do we want to be able to use all of the goods of the world? Are we, in a sense, sort of colonializing the rest of the world? These kinds of issues often find their way into conversation on college campuses. Students at lunch sometimes get to talking about these sorts of things. But it's important for us to stop and to realize that there is a set of theories that worry about this, and academic scholars and other kinds of writers that are concerned about the meaning that is underpinning the presentation of news and entertainment programming in mass-mediated communication. Images portrayed by the media may mask truths. Advertisements, for instance, may be very much criticized for this kind of outcome. We often see on television a lot of very healthy people. We particularly may see a lot of healthy children, or children that are easily made well because they have certain kinds of treatments, and then we may find out that there are children in our country, children around the world that just simply do not have the same kind of health and the kinds of future that many of us look toward or assume or take for granted. Ultimately, one of the key points in all of this is that news is not neutral, and it's not purely informative, but rather the news is persuasive. The news is trying to give us a view of the world. This is what happened, believe this is what happened. We've gone out and taken a snapshot of events. We've interviewed a few people who are knowledgeable of something, and this is what happened. This is, in a sense, this is true, but to be led to believe that, to accept that, assumes that in various ways we've actually been persuaded. So the notion of semiotics addresses the sorts of deep structures that exist within the mediated communication that we bring to ourselves, that we talk about what is good, what are our values. We often make those values very much known, and then only when we stop and think about it do we realize that the image of ourselves as a people reflected in our media may not be quite what we would want. Maybe it is exactly what we want. This is the sort of thing that the semiotics scholars pay attention to, but so also do the critical cultural theorists that are out there. One of the big differences, or one of the key components that the critical cultural people add in this discussion, is that they are very much concerned about some ideological assumptions. There were many people in the critical cultural movement as it began that said that we must have an economic system that we see as pure, see as preferable, and then we judge all other economic systems in the world against this one particular kind of model. If you recall, and I hope you are because you're getting closer to the time when you need to think about the use of alienation as a part of your paper, we talked about domineering or dominating. The critical cultural people worry a great deal about people who are wealthy, media elites, perhaps very much influenced by advertising, creating a view of the world, telling each of us that we must be consumers, arguing that we must spend our hours and days thinking of things to buy, because in good and gold and perhaps even in righteousness there is this notion of the commercial ethic. It is our identity, to the extent that we can be a part of that. So ideological perspectives become very important. Is the capitalist system one that does a lot to reduce alienation, bring us together, make us happy, or are we pitted against one another in a kind of competitive way that asks that some people are able to dominate others? Do we believe in getting and having and holding, or do we believe in sharing and making sure that everyone has what they need? These kinds of questions become very important. One of the concerns is that advertising dollars spent by large corporations and small businesses as well continually shape the news media, so that news media programming and editorial policy is not critical of an economic system that creates haves and have-nots, because that would be an unpopular point of view to put out, and therefore advertisers would not want their products associated with that idea. So there is a line of analysis. Writers such as Oscar Gandy is one of those, Michael Parenti is another one, who says that advertising dollars, advertisers with dollars to spend, end up creating news and programming content that fosters one narrow sense of the world, which may lead to alienation, which may dehumanize people at various times. Could be right interpretation, right-wing, leftist interpretation. We have feminist interpretations popping up in all of this. To what extent are women presented in a wholesome, proper, value-added way on television? Is the presentation of women way too narrow? Are they presented as being the person who has to do the dishes, to tend the child, to be the nurturer, the caretaker, whereas men have a variety of other roles that they have available to them? Are women limited? And here we get into some of the semiotics as well. When we look at television, do we see people of all ages, of both genders, of various kinds of ethnicity and race are presented in power figures within society? Are women judges? Are African American judges? Are Hispanics leaders? Are they engineers? Are they powerful individuals, as well as individuals at the lower end of the economic spectrum? Meaning that we do not relegate in our media content certain people in a sort of predetermined and structural way to be at the bottom of the society and other people to be at the top of society. We can say, for instance, that at various times the media have been very male-oriented, very white male, and very either upscale urban or then suburban in their mentality, imposing these kinds of values on the world. There is a backlash against that with critical cultural studies, which, as I say, include, for instance, feminist interpretations, leftist interpretations. One of the arguments is that politics is inseparable from media content. This even became a big theme in activism in the 60s, where the anti-car activists, the environmental responsibility activists, argued that General Motors and Dodge and Chrysler and Ford should not have all this opportunity to advertise that we should go out and buy automobiles and every year buy a new and better and bigger automobile and burn more and more gasoline. And there used to be a jingle on television, "See the USA in your Chevrolet." The argument by these activists was that that was very, very irresponsible, that people ought to use energy wisely, that they ought to conserve, they ought to be environmentally responsible. And so what seems to be purely commercial, transaction, evaluation, judgment, can in various ways be seen as highly political. Political textuality concerns how the media producers encode messages and then ultimately can influence the way in which audiences decode these messages. For instance, we go back to the role of women, and I think it's a very interesting one. We know that women and sporting events get far less attention, far less sponsorship than men do. And that can be a real problem in society because it can pass on to young women that men are stronger and dominant, they are more athletic, more sports-minded, and women have to play other roles in society. If we see ads on television where only little girls buy dolls and play with dolls, is that an appropriate image to convey? Now, we know there are certain genetic and biological realities in the world. And so we know that certain things happen in certain ways. To what extent are people socialized, in a sense, to be prepared for roles that they may play? Obviously, women become pregnant, and they do indeed give birth to children and play in various ways a primary caregiver of attention in some very biological ways. But is that a narrowing? If we carry that too far, do we have to be very careful? Should we show little girls playing with action figures, boys playing with dolls, girls playing with cars and earth-moving equipment, little boys playing with tea sets? What we find is that our advertising and programming can begin over time, people will argue, to set up frames of mind, points of reference, identities that are created through society that then may shape or even move us beyond what are really genetic traits and characteristics. If we find, for instance, that boys are more prone to misbehave in a classroom, is it because of the images of the males playing athletic events, the more rugged athletic events like football, and therefore boys are just doing what boys do because they've seen boys do that on television? Well, the critical cultural people, in their own way, interested in ideology as a sort of evaluative point of view. The semioticians, looking for the deep structures, become interested in how we portray ourselves, in a sense, to ourselves. To what extent are the media reflective of who we are? Do we have this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that if we talk to ourselves about being a particular way, that we sell that idea to ourselves in a very, very uncritical way? And then what's worse, according to the critical cultural theorists, is that the people with the advertising power, with the editorial power, with the program power, can decide what images to present and therefore have a disproportionate influence on society. Many of the critical cultural people, many of the semioticians have a very great concern because they believe they tend over toward that notion of dominant media effects. A great concern that repeated exposure to certain images then become what we can easily call self-fulfilling prophecies. The power then can be in the hands of a dominant elite, Power is crucial here because these elites, whether they are business elites or government elites or activist elites in some instances or religious elites, want a desired outcome as to how we're going to see ourselves, what we're going to think about ourselves, how we're going to communicate with ourselves, what we're going to say about ourselves as we communicate. The elites, the argument goes, seek to create an hegemony. Now, hegemony is a wonderful word, such a nice word that I like to put it on the review sheet and I like to put it on an examination. It's a word that you really ought to think about and to know. It is very much a taken for granted point of view that over time the elites sell this point of view because it privileges them, it allows them to continue to be in power, to be influential, to be in charge of being there, among other things, to recreate and to re-foster each generation of image as people comes along and they begin to experience through the media what subsequent generations have experienced. What often can be argued is that the media elite tend to exploit, tend to communicate in ways that privilege them and ultimately work to the disadvantage of persons targeted. This literature talks about news content, it talks about programming, the roles that are presented, the stereotypes, if you want to use that word, the attributions that are made. Certainly concerns itself about advertising as well. To what extent are the messages that are presented through advertising ones that are wholesome to us in terms of what we should be eating, the best foods, most nutritious lifestyles, healthy lifestyles, living a good life, or are we nevertheless sold on the assumption that if something can be made to look attractive, it is therefore healthy, and if we eat it, we will be healthy, when indeed a lot of times what we may find is that through our programs, through our advertising, we are a nation that is gaining weight. We maybe eat too much sugar. We maybe eat too much of the wrong kinds of fats. We don't eat a healthy diet. We don't get enough exercise. And part of the blame for this can be placed upon television. Now, whether that's a fair blame or not, it is a blame that is placed. We know even in that regard that there are lawsuits that say that the ads that are presented are indeed a contract, that if I act in a particular way based upon what I've seen in an ad, it's a contract and I can literally sue if I use that product. And we remember modeling theory, if I use that product and I seek those outcomes and I don't get those outcomes and I get other outcomes, I may actually have been defrauded, I may be lied to, and I can sue. Cigarette advertising has been characterized in this capacity. Alcohol advertising, beer and wine advertising. A very popular ad a number of months or years ago had a fellow out in the Rocky Mountains, I suspect, sitting on a log, sitting on a rock or something like that, all by himself, very lonely, pops open a Bush beer or whatever the brand was, and all of a sudden attractive young women come out and join him. Now, we know that that doesn't happen in life, and people say we know that that's advertising and no one believes in advertising. But one of the questions is, to what extent do we lie to ourselves? When do we lie to ourselves? When are people given false impressions about what products do? One of the things that's interesting is that HBO ran for a while a series of programs about children that were exposed to advertising, allowed to pick toys of their choice, and they found out that they were substantially disappointed. One that I saw had to do with children being allowed to pick shoes by sports figures that they admired. They were first of all given colored chalk on the tips of their fingers, the children were. They were allowed to jump, or asked, invited, challenged to jump against a wall so that they could mark how high they could jump with their tennis shoes on, their sports shoes. They then got to pick out the shoes of their choice. They again had chalk put on their fingers, they jumped, and some of the children didn't jump as high. The assumption being that they thought the shoes made the difference, not some other element. Michael Jordan will outjump me no matter what pair of shoes I wear. And I think that's a reality that sometimes gets kind of distorted in advertising, if you would. Similar and related to that, children were allowed to pick a toy that they liked. Several of them picked a hovercraft. They put it in the swimming pool and it sank. And one young lady, probably 8 or 9 or 10 or 11, 12 years old, just had the biggest disappointed look on her face because it didn't perform the way it did in advertising. We say if it works that way on advertising, it will work that way for me. That's what social learning tells us, is a way in which we use modeling, observational learning to learn about the world. And critical cultural people, semiotics, these folks tend to be concerned that we are presented with images that simply may not be true. The argument is that the media are the instruments of the power elite. Thus, for instance, business and media, supported by government and regulatory agencies, create ideologies that have political and marketing consequences that are used to control the masses for the selfish interest of the elites. That's kind of a synthesizing theme. If you wanted a theme that sort of said, what are they really concerned about? There is this conspiracy to dominate. It leads to alienation. We believe that we're being taken advantage. We don't believe that we're being played with fairly. And there tends to be this feeling of being dominated. Well, another theory, dependency theory. You remember before we talked about the two-step flow and how that research had grown out of people wondering to what extent various kind of media, particularly television, was going to influence or was influencing the way in which people formed opinions about voting preferences and then actually went out and voted. And so they went out and they asked people, to what extent did television or radio or print influence your judgment? What influenced your judgment most? And they found that most people said conversation with friends, colleagues, members of my union, people that I see at Bridge, people that I talk to at work. These are people that influence the ways in which I vote. So for a very long time, there has been this belief that interpersonal communication, the way in which we communicate with individuals around us on a daily basis, friends and family, work groups and so forth, influence very much what we see on television, for instance, what we read, what we hear, why we hear it. We consume the media as a part of our interpersonal patterns. Dating is a good example of this. We see opinion leaders, people who influence us through their conversation. We also begin to see groups, obviously, interpersonal relationships discussed on and in the media. So, out of this came a theory that suggests that our interpersonal lives will dominate and have greater influence than our mediated lives if we have a rich and useful interpersonal set of relationships. To the extent that we don't, we may gravitate more to media to fill in the gaps. Media use and impact result from a balance between depending on others, that means people that we're in contact with, social contacts, and the media for information, persuasion, and entertainment. And entertainment becomes very important. We, at various times, having children say, get up and get away from the television and go out and play with other children. We put them into situations where they have to play with other individuals. We think that social skills and interpersonal activities with other human beings is a very important and enriching part of people's lives, not just being a passive consumer of television, for instance. There's a very strong literature on this topic. One of the most embracing theories, dependency theory, because it captures ideas in many of the others that we've talked about. Social categories theory, meaning that we tend to view television as a category. We tend to see ourselves presented there in varying ways. That means then as we talk with other people, we may reflect, saying, you know, that television doesn't have anything to do with me, or it's addressing topics that are very relevant to me. Systems theory, we've talked about that, how what gets into a system, is the media our only system, or are there other elements of our system, including interpersonal communication? Uses and gratifications theory, to what extent do we enjoy engaging in media utilization with other people? We have book clubs, we have discussions about books. Sometimes it's just purely informal. People in a group, we know, for instance, that after the show had ended without us knowing the outcome. Who shot JR? There was a lot of discussion in business settings and so forth. Media effects, socialization, two-step, multi-step flow, topics that I've talked about before. Well, the literature is really growing in this area. It looks at the reasons that media use, and the impact depends upon the role of the media among many other influences within a person's life. The assumption is that we have this innate need for self-efficacy. And in that need for self-efficacy, our social group is influential to the extent that we have a robust and useful social group. One of the things that I find interesting is that we talk about how television over time becomes the companion of the elderly. When people get older and they become less mobile, they may tend to use television for a lot of things, including just being able to hear other voices within the house so that people do not feel as lonely. Now, to some extent, radio may work. There are people that say, well, I like to listen to the radio, I like to listen to music, I like to listen to talk shows. But what we find is that it is something like talk shows, or it's something like sitcoms where there are dramas, there are developing complications, the kinds of subtle nuances of life, and sometimes not so subtle, that happen in soap operas. Years ago, when my mother was living to some extent alone in a kind of special care facility, she lived in an apartment. She had a fair amount of mobility, but still many hours of the day she was by herself. Did not actually mind being by herself, but still liked to have her friends at various times to visit with. And I would go up there, my wife and I, my wife and daughter and I would go up there, and Mom would say at certain times, get kind of interested, saying, well, I better turn on my soaps. Now, I don't watch these all the time. I rarely watch them actually, but I just every once in a while like to tune in. Now, we figured that Mom really did like to watch her soaps, and part of it was to see social drama, see social interactions. Here she was, a hard-working farm woman, probably wanted to see people get into trouble so she could say, see, that's what happens when you do those sorts of things. You get into trouble. You ought to live a different life than that. Give herself some sense of feeling that she was a woman of good personality, a good character, good values. Media influences and utilizations becomes a part of this. Personal needs. What needs do we have? Remember when we talked about needs and uses and gratifications, personal integrative needs, social integrative needs. To the extent that we don't have those with other people, with humans, real live human beings, we may turn more to television or to radio or to books. But when the people are there and say, come on and let's go do something, there is this tendency to be active and to not pay quite as much attention to television. So the notion of dependency is this interaction between the people in our lives and our use of them for entertainment, news, persuasion, and so forth, as opposed to relying more on television. Media utilization and the impact of media tends to follow social group norms. People use media as social contact. People use media to have social contact. People use media content to define social norms, what's right and what's wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that the television always tells us what's right and wrong. My mother knew what was right and wrong. There was no doubt about that. But I think there were times when she liked to see people get into trouble. Their lives got messed up because she would say, see, you weren't living the proper kind of a life. You were doing things you shouldn't. Somebody probably told you you shouldn't do that. You don't listen to people, and you get yourself into trouble. Undoubtedly, we feel good when we see people make mistakes, and we feel vindicated if we would not have done that in that particular way. A group membership can predict media use and influence. If groups provide information, attitude, entertainment, then the media are simply utilized less. If the groups that we belong to do not provide information, attitude, entertainment, then the media will be utilized more on the assumption that we need to play, we need news, we need information, we need persuasion. When we ask people which influences your purchasing decisions more, your friends and the products that they find satisfying or something that you've seen on television, again, we often say, I rely upon my friends. I see something advertised on television, I may very much discuss it with my friends to see if my friends confirm or disconfirm those purchasing preferences, their reactions to those products and such. Well, what are the predictors then that we look for in how this theory works in the lives of individuals? First of all, we look for the presence of group norms, opinions, and activities to the extent that they're well defined, well prescribed. That can influence very, very much what people do or what people do not do. One of the things that I found very interesting in my daughter's growing up as a young woman was that she and her friends liked to be leaders in discovering new groups, new bands, new sounds, new lyrics, whatever it might be. And so she thought of herself as kind of a leader in this regard. And so in a sense it was creating or reacting to a group norm that we had to be leaders, they had to be leaders, formulate opinions, have activities, do things like that. Some of this you can learn about from television, but sooner or later it may become a very real part of what you do with your friends, your family, and so forth. Secondly, the need to comply with the group. If the group is very important to me, I'm going to bend and go with the group despite whatever it is that I may discover on television. We find some of this about health, that we can do health programming, we can do safety programming, but if there are group norms that are stronger than the persuasive messages on television, I may very well go along with my group. Meaning then that if we want to use television or other media to influence people, we've got to do that as a part of what is normal and natural and an extension of their group norms. The degree to which the group has well-formed opinions. If the group has well-formed opinions, then we use the media to confirm. Anything the media doesn't confirm, we reject. If the if the group does not have well-formed opinions, then the media may help us to understand what's going on. But you keep in mind what our anchoring theme in all of this is, that the groups, the people that we associate with, our interpersonal relationships are very important to us, and the media often have to adapt to or utilized for purposes of negotiating, maintaining these particular relationships. A person's sense of dependence or independence, and then ultimately the availability of the media. There is even literature that focuses very much upon the assumption that within society there are innovators. And I can even flip back just a little bit on this. We often talk about campaigns that are put together to go out and to achieve something that is pretty interesting or beneficial. Sometimes these are even marketing campaigns. I remember as a youngster the introduction of hybrid corn. Now, it would be very difficult to tell all of you all about this so that you would understand it as I would want you to, but just accept for a moment that there was one kind of corn used by farmers to plant and create their harvest, and then a new kind of corn comes along. The new kind of corn is supposed to be a lot better, giving a lot more yield, being more resistant. The problem is that you could not save your own corn and plant it next year because it was hybrid corn. So you were dependent upon the people that sold you the corn not to, in a sense, have an undue influence over you by being able to charge you more for seed corn than would be reasonable. Could be a trap, could be a trick, could be alienation involved in this. So one of the things that the company did selling this corn was to make it available to some of the best farmers in a community. They were supposed to indicate by putting an ear of corn, it was a little sign, metal ear of corn, with the name of the company on it on fence posts, so that you could go and look and see how well their corn was doing. And I remember on a Sunday afternoon, we might load up in the family pickup and go and stop, and my dad would get out and go out into the field and look around and inspect the corn because the innovators were sort of leading us to this, and it was the interpersonal contact, being able to talk to people, that made the campaign successful. And health campaigns are often built upon exactly that same kind of theme. So dependency theory is often very, very much a part of some of the experiences that we get in life, and also it can be used strategically for things such as health communication campaigns. Well, the last theory that we're going to talk about fairly sophisticated theory, a lot of work to be done, but it's kind of an interesting theory because it suggests that we have to really understand all of the aspects of the human mind and cognitions, the ways in which we think and know and handle the symbols and the messages and the experiences in our life, so that we can fully appreciate the way in which the media are either able to satisfy those experiences, add to those experiences, and perhaps even shape those experiences. And so in that regard, cognitive theory addresses very basic elements of what goes into media literacy. The assumption is that we have to learn how to use media. We have to learn that as we have to learn anything else. Now, I find it interesting to have 2 grandchildren and to watch children's programming with them and to see what they learn. And you know, for instance, that we had a couple of children's programs in our collection of clips for this particular class. One of them was from a program called Blue's Clues. One of them was from a program very familiar to many of you in your generation, Sesame Street. To what extent does the design of something for children have to be different than something designed for people with more experience in utilizing media? Not necessarily more intelligence. We may think about it as intelligence, but children are very bright. It's just that they have maybe limited experience. They have a limited vocabulary. They have a limited sense of what goes on. They may not remember very well. One of the things that we know is that children's memories are not necessarily very good. Adults' memories may not be very good, but children's memories may not be very good as well. They experience stuff, they lock it away, but they don't necessarily lock it away and think about it when they think about it later on. We have much more facility in recalling things from our memory than children may at times, because children are still absorbing so much, they haven't learned the skill of a great deal of memory recall. It's something that they have to do. So people will develop a media literacy as they learn to use the media and be gratified by them. How they learn to use the media influences how they use these. Now, there is a wonderful model on page 372 in the text that sort of draws all of this together. But what I want to do is to sort of look at each of the components that we can address as we think about the cognitive elements that go into helping us to understand what goes on. But let's back up just a minute to sort of frame this discussion. It is altogether possible, as we've said before, that each generation learns a music which is very familiar to it, and then what comes along after it, it really doesn't like. It doesn't sound right. You have to learn to listen to various kinds of music. Rock and roll came along, people wanted big band, and they couldn't stand the sound of rock and roll. It made the wrong kinds of rhythms. It was the wrong kind of this, that, and the other thing. There were a lot of things to complain about it. Well, that's because we learn music is of one kind, and then other music is different, and we may not like it. We may not appreciate it. We often run into this when we hear music from very different cultures. People who have listened to the music that is very popular in the Middle East, for instance, if they come from a more Western tradition, if they've been raised on rock and roll or country western, and they hear this music, it may not be very appealing to them necessarily, because the ways in which people learned that music and learned to appreciate it, learned its aesthetic, learned that it could satisfy their pleasure principle, was quite important to that music, but doesn't easily just occur if we experience something that we've never experienced for the first time. Now, when we then think about how we learn to use the media and how it becomes, in a sense, then almost a way in which we think, one of the key elements of this is that there are learned goals. How do we learn to use the media to solve problems, get the weather, get news, see what's going on? Children very early realize that the media can provide entertainment. It can be amusing to them. What's also interesting is that children often like to see the same thing over and over again. They like to have the same story read over and over again. And if you try to change the story on the child, even though the child couldn't remember to tell the story, the child can remember the story well enough to know that if you change it, that the story has been changed, and children often don't like that. They want the story told over and over and over again in exactly the same way because, in a sense, that is that story. We learn to use media to satisfy these goals that we have learned. If we like football, it's because we have learned to like football. And what's interesting is that sometimes in family relationships, this can become a point of abrasiveness. There are programs where people can go and learn to watch sports, learn about sports. There is a vocabulary, there are actions, there are subtleties, and if we don't know what the vocabulary is and the actions and the subtleties of the game, we may not appreciate it. And that can strain interpersonal relationships because people say, you must not like me because you don't like football. Or conversely, you like football more than you like me. And some of it may simply be what we've learned, the ways in which we've learned, or the ways in which we've not learned something, and then to the extent to which we see it as gratifying or pleasurable, etc., etc. Goal specifications, the extent to which we specify what our goals are. In one way, we are, in a sense, trained this by television. Television puts on the news unless the news is on 24/7, or the news is on at certain times. It breaks into regular programming. The news is on at certain times. The news on television is on in the morning. It's on again at noon. It's on again at 5 o'clock and 5:30, maybe even at 6 o'clock, and then it's on at 10 o'clock. The news is on at certain times. So we know what is there. We go to a movie to see a movie. We tune in a sitcom to see a sitcom. So we know what these are. We know what the kind of entertainment is. We know what a comedy is. We know what a romance is. We know what a chick flick is. We know what a guy flick is. We know what an action flick is. We know what a mystery is. We know what a foreign film is. We know all of this kind of thing, and therefore we can understand it. Now, grammar becomes something a little bit more subtle. In one sense, a grammar is like the evolution of a sentence. There is a way in which words have got to go together for the sentence to ultimately to make sense. It cannot be random. It has to be predictable. One of the reasons that we learn language is that it has to be predictable. And even if it is an ungrammatical sentence, it can be predictable and understandable, even if it violates the norms of what a better crafted sentence might be. Now, along with that notion then is that there are grammars in a sitcom. There are certain things that people do and say to one another, and they do it and say it in a particular way. They use various kinds of vocabularies, and again, you can go back and look at Blue's Clues, because at various times the fellow that's in charge of getting the clues says, what do we have to do? Well, one of the things that we have to do is we have to get our notebook. And what do we have to do? We go over and sit in our thinking chair. That's what we have to do. Children are taught these kinds of routines. They are taught these kinds of grammars. There is a semantic dictionary. The semantic dictionary can include the characters and the actors. You know actors that I simply do not know, do not necessarily care to know. I have not watched any episode of Friends ever, except the episodes that would be for this class, so that I could maybe talk to you and explain to you something about those. But you know the characters. You know the history of the characters. And that becomes important. Semantic dictionary, the words over time, the episodic memory, the way in which episode 1 leads up to episode 2, episode 3 and such, so that there is this evolution of character. And finally, semantic memory, remembering the terms that are used. And when we talk about semantic, we can also talk about the images that are used. Now, all of this gets together in a very, very sort of complicated way. The assumption arguably is that we develop media literacy. One of the arguments that people in various programs on a university campus is that they try to increase students' literacy, expose them to better literature, to enhance their vocabulary, for instance, to enhance their appreciation. We can talk about film appreciation, we can talk about music appreciation, we can talk about art appreciation. All of these are ways in which we try to enhance the understanding of students and other people on various kinds of media utilization. It is learnable, we say. We learn it from one another. Parents explain a lot of television to children. Children at times can get very, very confused what is real and what is not real. And one of the assumptions that we make is that parents can help them to sort that out. You may remember when we were talking about Van Evera's model, that if children see something as real, it has a different impact on them than if they see it as distanced, as though it is unreal. And children many times when they watch programming can see it as something not at a distance, but something that can really happen and could really happen to them, and it can be very disturbing to them at times. It can give them bad dreams, bad memories, bad thoughts. But as they learn more and more that it is simply a way in which they can see this plot evolved with these characters, they can learn to enjoy it if it is enjoyable for what it is, and then set it aside and go on to other kinds of experiences. What's also interesting is that as various kind of programming occurs, Hollywood or the television producers, the directors and so forth have to sort of teach us over time how to experience new formats. We, in the last number of years, have now had reality television. Reality television is something that we've had to learn. They had to learn how to present it. Actually, it was developed in England, I guess, or maybe even on the continent, and imported to the United States and given our own particular twist and flares. But there are ways of doing it. What makes a dramatic moment in reality television is when it is done differently. This one of the last of the reality programs, instead of having people get out on the island and then begin their adventures, I recall they actually made them in relatively good clothes jump off of a boat and begin their experience having to swim or wade to shore. Well, we know what we've experienced. This sort of stores up in us. We know the characters. We know the repeated characters. We know characters that stand out in time. We know the Tom Hanks. We know the Jennifer Anistons. We know the John Waynes. We know all of these people. And in some way or another, we put this together with the stimuli that is provided for us by the medium that we are experiencing. It makes sense to us or it does not make sense. It is enjoyable to us or it is not enjoyable. But the key that we're arguing here is that in many instances, over time, we have to realize that there's an interaction between the media and the people that consume and use the media, and that as much as the media shapes people, people also shape the media. There is an interaction. And I guess one of the bottom lines that I want to put in here is that when we think about dominant media effects, I think what we have to realize is that to some very real extent, we have to keep in mind as we think about the nature of media and the role in our life, that there is indeed something of the sort of the sovereign viewer, the listener, the sovereign reader, that people have an effect upon what they see and what they experience and what they get because they show up or they don't show up. It was useful and it was gratifying or it was not. It was a part of their social life that they liked. It added and contributed to their social life. It explained, made their social life a bit more useful, or it did not. Cognitively, they could learn it, they could learn to appreciate it and enjoy it, and it was something that added value to them. So in a way, we begin then to see the role of mass-mediated communication as a part of our culture, as a part of our society, as a part of our lives. There is certainly an interaction, whether we dominate it or not. You're all welcome to argue as you would, but it seems pretty likely that indeed we influence the media as the media influence us. This point is going to be made even more as we explore what we're going to in Chapter 10, and that is new communication technology. So that ends our discussion of Chapter 9 and mass-mediated communication.
Thank you.